Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Book Passage. I'm pleased you could join us tonight, and I am delighted to introduce author and journalist Denise Kiernan. She's here to discuss her latest book, The Girls of Atomic City, putting together her interview skills and her journalist skills, putting them to good use in creating a very fascinating portrait of the women who worked and were involved in the Manhattan Project, from secretaries to scientists, all living together in a secret city in Tennessee, doing very secret work, being sworn to secrecy, and doing their part in the war effort. Just what that meant exactly and the consequences of their actions, that was not really well known to them at the time, and it certainly was not discussed. So for many, it was a chance at being independent, for earning some much needed cash, and for helping to end the war for their brothers and loved ones. Denise has gone to heroic efforts to show us tonight a photo presentation of some of these women, and each of the photos I think you'll see kind of tell a story and a part of this larger story in itself. Denise is also the author of several books on American history, including one of our favorites here at Book Passage, Stuff Every American Should Know. It's a tiny little book, it's adorable, you should pick it up. She co-authored it with her husband, the writer Joseph Dagnays, and her writing has appeared in major publications like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So please join me in a warm welcome for Denise Kiernan.
Thank you. That ought to do it. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you very, very much to Book Passage, not only for this event, but for making all kinds of events like this possible. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to support independent businesses, to support independent bookstores. Just to give you an idea, for every $100 that you spend at a store like this, roughly 88 will stay in your community. At a big box store, it could be as little as $43 out of every 100. When you shop at a place like this, you're supporting your community, you're supporting events, and I just think it's a wonderful thing to do. And so I'm so glad you guys exist, and thank you for having me. So let me get all situated here. Maybe I'm gonna bring this over. Can I do that? Much better. Okay, so yes, this is a narrative nonfiction book. It is about young women living in a secret government city in East Tennessee working on the Manhattan Project. However, they did not know that at the time. Now, just so everybody's clear, the Manhattan Project was a secret project during World War II designed to harness the power of fission, the splitting of the atom, and it resulted in the world's first atomic weapons. So that was the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project had three main sites. One was Hanford Engineer Works in Washington State. Another was Clinton Engineer Works, or Oak Ridge, in Tennessee, where the majority of my book takes place. And the third was Los Alamos in New Mexico, which many of us have heard about. Now those were the three main sites. Different companies and organizations and research facilities throughout the country played roles in the Manhattan Project, many, many states. But those were the three main sites created to work on the project during World War II. So when I talk about the book, one of the first questions I always get is, what made you want to write this book? How did you find the topic? And this is how I found it. So I just stumbled across this picture, complete dumb luck. And I was actually working on another project. This is a real problem for writers. You're supposed to be focused on one thing, and then you see something else that you find that's interesting, and then you get distracted. So I saw this picture one day, and at first I just thought it was really kind of a beautiful photo. It has sort of this vanishing point at the end of the room, and I looked at these giant machines. I had no idea what they were about, and in contrast, you had these young women sitting in front of this kind of gauntlet of technology here. They've got those cute little 1940s hairstyles, and they're sitting up straight, and I was just sort of drawn, sucked into the picture, and then I read the accompanying text, and it said something along the lines of, these young women, many of them recent high school graduates from rural Tennessee, are helping to enrich uranium for the world's first atomic bomb, only they didn't know that at the time. And I was floored. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh, it must be one of those knowledge gaps we all have. I bet everybody knows about this. I just, slept that day in history class. So I started asking people I thought, would be smart history buffs, a friend who's a professor at a very reputable university I will not mention, and no one knew anything about these girls in Tennessee working on the atomic bomb. So I thought, okay, well, I'm onto something. And I had read a lot about the Manhattan Project. I find that period in history fascinating. But I soon realized that the perspective that I have was very similar to the perspective of all the different people I talked to. And it's this. It's the Robert Oppenheimers, it's the General Leslie Groveses, it's the Enrico Fermis and the Arthur Comptons. And this is a fascinating perspective and a very valuable perspective, but it's not the only one. And I realized that when we tell this story, and it's been told many, many times, it usually is from a very top-down kind of perspective, from the perspective of people in the know, people who were making decisions, people who had all the facts at their disposal. And I just kept thinking to myself, well, what did, I kept going back to that photo and thinking, well, what did these young women think about this? What did the Manhattan Project look like through their eyes? And when you're talking about an event that has such tremendous worldwide impact and continues to today, I think we kind of owe it to ourselves to explore everybody's perspective, not just the folks who, were in charge. So I found out, lucky me, that Oak Ridge, Tennessee was about 2 hours away by car from my house. So I just got in my car and went over there. And it was still there, thank goodness. And I tracked down a local historian. He introduced me to a man who was a supervisor in one of the plants. In fact, he is standing in the back of the room in that photo I just showed you. And that was Connie Bowling. He's the first man I ever interviewed. He was 101 when I talked to him. Sharp as a tack. And as I was leaving his assisted living facility, I went down into the lobby and ran into a woman named Colleen. And Colleen and I hit it off immediately, and she became one of the main characters in my book. And that's kind of how it went. I would meet someone, they'd introduce me to 2 other people who would say, come to this historic preservation meeting. And so I just kept going back and forth, and just anybody, would talk to anybody who would let me. And, sometimes I would just sit in the lobby of the assisted living facility and stalk octogenarians, like anybody who came through. I would just, did you live and work here during World War II? I'm 63, I'm sorry, you look fantastic, And because I just wanted as many different perspectives as I could get. So I wanted people who had worked in different plants, and people who had, done different administrative posts, and any kind of people who were married, people who weren't married. And so that I could piece together this story, but always through the eyes of those women. So this is Celia. I love that picture. Celia was actually working as a secretary for the Manhattan Project, but she didn't know that, up in New York City. So the Corps of Engineers, which oversaw the Manhattan Project, they have what they do is they name their military projects based on geographic location. So before they built those 3 main sites I told you about, there were administrative offices in New York City. So it was called the Manhattan Engineer District. So that's what later became referred to as the Manhattan Project. So Celia gets called into the offices one day, and her boss says, you're doing a great job. We're moving offices, we'd love for you to come with us. She says, oh, thank you. Where are we going? And he goes, well, I can't really get into that. It's in the South. She says, okay. How long am I gonna be there? 6 months, maybe 9. Okay, what am I gonna be doing? Probably something similar to what you're doing now, but that might change. She said, okay, so if I don't know where I'm going, how am I going to get there? It's a fair question. He said, oh no, that's not a problem. We're gonna send somebody to your sister's house to pick you up. They're gonna take you to the train station. Tickets, all that will be taken care of. Someone on the train will tell you when to get off. And then when you get off, someone there will tell you what to do next. and she buys a new dress and packs up a suitcase and off she goes, off into who knows where. And quite adventurous, I think. And this is one of the aspects of the story that's kind of tricky for people to understand, especially today, because we're very curious and we want to know things and we want to know it right now, And it's really hard if you didn't live through it to understand the impact that World War II had on people's lives. I mean, it touched everybody's lives. All the movies were about the war. All the songs were about the war. Comic books were about the war. And the day that Celia got on that train to go to some crazy place she didn't know the name of, her one brother was shipped off to Italy, and a couple weeks later another one was shipped off to the Pacific. So, for her, all she needed to know was that she was going to be doing her part, and that was enough for her. And she was also kind of, excited about the adventure. So what does she see when she gets there? First thing she sees is a big gate. This was a very secure location. Now you can see there were guards, there were guns, barbed wire. Everything was checked. Everything was searched when you went in and out. As you can see up at that top, it's hard to read. It says military area, and it talks about all the things that are forbidden. Radio transmitters and field glasses and explosives, and also alcohol. But this was Tennessee in the 40s, so there were ways around that. And everybody had all these different stories about how they would sneak alcohol past the guards, because the wheel well and the glove compartment, that was amateur hour. What they would do is the winning combination was to take a dirty diaper bag and put the alcohol at the bottom of it, because the guards wouldn't dig down to the bottom. So that was how a lot of people used to sneak, get their hooch inside the gates. But this was, if you lived in Oak Ridge, this is a residence pass from 1943. You had passes for everything, passes and badges. So you had a pass if you were living, just to live on the reservation, as they referred to it at times. And you also had a separate badge that allowed you access to wherever you worked. So for example, if you worked in the Y12 plant, you could not get on a bus that was going to K25. And there were people who constantly walked around and rode buses and things and would check badges and make sure nobody was going where they weren't supposed to be going. Children had passes as well. Everybody had passes. There was also a lot of mud. So a tremendous amount of mud. To give you an idea, Oak Ridge was purpose-built, okay? So there were a lot of things in World War II that were repurposed for the war. A factory that was making pots and pans started making shell casings, for example. Oak Ridge was started out as about 56,000 acres, then got up to about 58,000 acres. It was taken by eminent domain in 1942. About 1,000 families had to move off their land. Between the time they broke ground in late 1942 and the middle of 1945, less than 3 years, it went from 0 to almost 80,000 residents, using more electricity than New York City, and with one of the country's largest bus systems. And it was not on a map. And it would not be on a map until 1949, 4 years after the war was over. So when you dig all that stuff up that quickly, and trees and shrubs and clearing things out, you end up, when it rains, the locals would call the heavy rains frog stranglers, you end up with an awful lot of mud. And in fact, this gives you a little idea about the size of Oak Ridge. So you can see the river is on about 3 sides, the Clinch, 7 different gates. The plants are in red, and the original site for dorms and housing and things is up in that little striped area called Oak Ridge, although different housing areas did start to pop up in other areas as the need grew. The population grew so much faster than they anticipated. They ended up needing so many more people than they originally thought. So Celia's first day, actually, she saw a woman sink down to her knees in the mud and had to be physically removed by 2 men. And her shoes stayed in the mud. So Celia's new dress went right in the closet, and she never wore it again. This is Tony. Through Tony, I was able to kind of talk about what it was like for the surrounding communities. Oak Ridge was secret, but it wasn't invisible, you know. So if you were in the area, it was very clear that something very big was going on over there. And so Tony was in the class of 1943, so that graduating class was watching what was going on down the road very closely. A lot of them, of course, wondering if there would be jobs for them. They'd hear about somebody who got a job over there, and you know, they'd ask them, like, what are you doing over there? And they'd say, I don't know. He said, but you're working there. Well, I'm doing my thing, but I have no idea what's going on. And you know, they watched this site get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the joke started to be, everything's going in and nothing's coming out. Because you know, to take a city from 0 to 80,000 people in under 3 years, that's a lot of construction. In fact, at the height of construction, there was a house going up 1 every 30 minutes. So women would joke about walking to work, and on the way home, the street would look completely different. You'd have these train cars and trucks pull right up to the edge of the Clinton Engineer Works, Oak Ridge, and the control of, say, the train would pass from the Louisville and Nashville employees to the Manhattan Project employees, and these cars and trucks would be piled with literally hundreds of millions of feet of board lumber and, you know, chemicals and supplies and housing supplies and food, and they'd go in just, you know, chock full of stuff, and everything that came back out was completely empty. And the place just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and no one ever saw a tire go out, nobody ever saw a tank go out, nobody ever saw anything go out, because the only thing that was leaving was, you know, a container about a little smaller than this in a briefcase handcuffed to somebody's wrist. So it was this big mystery. They just watched this site get bigger and bigger, and it was making something. They had no idea what it was because what was leaving was so small. Yeah. There we go. So this is a wonderful Norman Rockwell image. I like this one because to me it sort of captures all the various opportunities that women had in World War II. World War II was a transformative moment for women in the workforce out of necessity because so many men were gone. There were opportunities for women to do jobs they'd never been able to do before, to make money they had never been able to make before. I love this because she's doing a little bit of everything. She's a nurse, she's a bus driver, she's got a wrench, she's got a lantern, she's planting her victory garden, and she still has milk because on top of all this, she's still taking care of, her home. And Oak Ridge was similar in that because it was a functioning city, there were a lot of jobs that you would see outside the gates as well. There were administrative jobs. I mean, anything that would, come up that would help somebody, there were schools, you needed teachers, you needed bus drivers. I love this photo. This is the telephone bank, and you could not drop a call. So these ladies are standing here waiting for the shift change so they can dive on the board and make sure no calls are dropped. I want to point out these photos were all taken by a man named Ed Westcott. There's a little Rosie at the K-25 plant. Ed was the official photographer for the Manhattan Project during World War II in Oak Ridge. These all came from the National Archives. He's an amazing photographer. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him several times. He's 91 years old. He still lives in Oak Ridge. This is a close-up of one of those machines I showed in that first photo. If you're interested in Ed's photos, I highly recommend going to photosofedwestcott.tumblr.com. You can find all sorts of stuff. There's a link to that on my website and on my book website as well. He's a real treasure and a fantastic photographer. This is Elizabeth Edwards. So in addition to jobs in the plants and administrative jobs and jobs working in town, they also established a recreational organization, and they knew they wanted a library for the kids and for wives and things. And they didn't mess around. They brought down Elizabeth from the main branch of the New York City Public Library on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And she came down and established the library and established a little rolling library that would roll around through the mud and go to the different housing areas so people could get books. And of course, there were a lot of mothers there too. There were construction people and plumbers and scientists coming to Oak Ridge to work, and they brought their families with them. So there were a lot of, mothers there too. So through each, one of these women, I tried to, show a different part of life. So this is Helen. She's one of my main girls. She was recruited out of a diner in Murfreesboro, Tennessee when she was 18. This is Celia, who we saw in the very first picture, and that was not too long ago. So 6 to 9 months ended up being 70 years. She still lives there. This is Jane. She's we'll hear a little bit more about her in a second. This is Celia, Rosemary. She was recruited out of a hospital in Chicago. She was brought down to start the first clinic. She was in charge of the entire emergency room, in fact. And of course, again, because this was a functioning city, you needed everything, including, clinics and hospitals. And this is Colleen, who I met in the assisted living facility. And through Colleen, here's her badge picture when she was working. Through Colleen, I got to explore what it was like for families in Oak Ridge. This is a shot, this is Happy Valley. Doesn't it just scream Happy Valley? This was, again, when they originally started building Oak Ridge, they thought maybe they'd have 13,000 people there. And they ended up with 80,000. When they couldn't get houses up fast enough, dorms up fast enough, they would bring in trailers and just plop them down. Colleen came with many members of her immediate and extended family. At one point, there were 9 of them living in a trailer. Oak Ridge ran 24 hours a day, and there were 24-hour, there were shifts constantly. So she and the rest of the members of her family who were working would try and arrange their schedules so that you could sleep in shifts and work in shifts, and there would always be a bed there for somebody who was, not working at the time. Another thing that her family did was hang a service flag in their window. This is a service flag. There were blue stars and gold stars. If you hung a blue star in your window, and you could see them all across the United States, if you hung a blue star in your window, that meant that a loved one was away fighting. If you had a gold star in your window, that meant that you had lost someone. So this is an image from the National Archives, and this says, because somebody talked. So in other words, the blue star has turned gold because somebody talked. And Colleen also had a brother away fighting. This is where Colleen worked. This is the K-25 plant, an aerial view of the K-25 plant. That's it in the middle. Largest building in the world. And remained that for actually many years. 44 acres of floor space under one roof. It was so big, messengers rode bicycles around to take information from one part of the plant to the other. Now, what cracks me up is, considering the fact that they're trying to hide that they're enriching uranium, they probably could have chosen a better shape than a U-shaped, building. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. But huge, tremendous plant. Colleen worked inspecting pipes. So these little millwrights would bring pipes over and she would check the welds. And that's what she did day in and day out. And this was compartmentalization. One of the things that enabled them to keep so much of what went on in the Manhattan Project secret was compartmentalization. You were trained to do your job as well as you could, and you didn't get any more information. So all she knew was how to check the welds on the pipes. Didn't know where the pipes were coming from, didn't know where they were going, didn't know what the pipes were going to be carrying. And what you did day to day would sometimes sort of influence what you thought might be going on there. A woman named Dot, who worked in the Y12 plant, that picture we saw at the very beginning, that plant was managed by Tennessee Eastman. So she thought, oh, Tennessee Eastman, they develop film and things. We must be helping develop those war films that you see before the main picture show at the movie theater. So Dot thought they were making war films because Tennessee Eastman was in her day-to-day life. There was another woman, and her best friend was convinced she knew what was going on, and it had something to do with urine. She was absolutely sure that they were doing something with urine, because when you came to work, you were processed, and you had clearances to get, and you signed the Espionage Act, and you took a physical, and you gave a urine sample. And this woman's job was to label everybody's urine sample. So in her mind, she was absolutely sure the military had figured out a way to weaponize urine. So it was really interesting when you don't get that much information, you just kind of look at what you see every day and come up with all sorts of stuff. This is Katie Strickland. and those are Katie's biscuit pans, and we'll talk about those in a second. Through Katie, I was able to explore race in the Manhattan Project. Oak Ridge was completely segregated. There were segregated living facilities, there were segregated recreational facilities. Here's a post office, segregated cafeterias. There were the white men and women lived in areas called hutments. So Katie lived in one of these with 4 other women. Husbands and wives were not permitted to live together. So she was not allowed to live with her husband. There were separate areas. Guards regulated who came and went. She was allowed to go visit him, but he was not allowed to come visit her. And the guards would check that you were out by the time you were supposed to. But I mean, tremendous. The Manhattan Project would not have existed without the African American workforce. I was very, very lucky. Katie was willing to share so much of her experience with me. I did a lot of my research at the National Archives, not just in the Atomic Energy Commission files, but also in the Fair Employment Practice Commission files. And there were complaint letters that had been written by people living, black workers, to their bosses, letters to President Roosevelt detailing the conditions where they lived, the fact that they'd been told they'd be able to live with their spouses, but then they weren't. And then one of the more, one of the really heartbreaking aspects of life was that they were not allowed to bring their children with them. So Katie and Willie, her husband, had to leave their children back home in Alabama, and they worked extensively and sent as much money home as they could. And the reason they did, she told me, was because they were making more than twice as much money as they would have been had they stayed back home. So her biscuit pans. So she's working in K-25, she was a janitor, and she notices this welder is throwing away these pieces of scrap metal that he's not using. So she yells up to him and she says, "Make me a biscuit pan." And sure enough, she comes in the next day and this guy has made her 3 biscuit pans. So they're not supposed to cook in the huts, but she hated the food in the cafeteria, so she figures out a way to use the potbelly stove in the middle of the hut, and they're all, combining their ration coupons, because you had coupons for all sorts of stuff during the war, and she starts making biscuits. Well, she makes really good biscuits. So she starts using these biscuits to bribe the guards to let her spend more time with her husband, which I thought was brilliant, and such tremendous spirit in the face of so many horrible things. And those are those biscuit pans. She still cooks on them. She's 96 years old. I saw her a few weeks ago, and she still cooks dinner for her whole family every Sunday, and she does use the K-25 biscuit pans. This is Jane. Jane was a very, very intelligent woman who wanted to be an engineer. So she wanted to go to the University of Tennessee and be an engineer. She shows up to register for classes, stands online, and gets a little tap on the shoulder, and a man tells her, "I'm sorry, you can't be an engineer, you're a woman." "I've got the grades, you're a woman. Why don't you go try this brand new program we have, Business Administration and Statistics?" And she's, "Well, what choice do I have? Okay, I'll try Business Administration and Statistics." So she graduates, and she actually becomes not just the first woman, but the first person to graduate from the University of Tennessee with this particular degree. And she gets a great job in Oak Ridge overseeing a whole team of number crunchers. And they didn't know it at the time, but they were actually doing complex calculations that were determining production rates for one of the plants. So she saved all of her pay stubs, which was really wonderful, and all sorts of documentation. Up in the corner here, she added this post-it years later because she wanted to remember. It said, "I had men working beneath me who were making more than me." So that's what she wrote on those little post-its in the corner. So it's so interesting because, World War II, a moment of tremendous opportunity for women, but things still were not fair by any stretch of the imagination. So Jane allowed me to explore that a little in the book. So how do you keep something like this so secret? Well, there were reminders. Now, keeping quiet was not exclusive to the Manhattan Project during World War II. We all remember the phrase, "loose lips sink ships." This was something that was heard all over the place. There were advertisements, Stetson, the folks who make the hat, had an advertisement in a magazine back then said, keep it under your Stetson. I mean, everything was about not talking too much about what was going on. So that message was just taken to an extreme degree with the Manhattan Project because of the nature of the work that was going on there. So this is this billboard, actually somebody told me at one of my recent talks, they had lived in Oak Ridge, this was up until the early 90s. This billboard right here was still in Oak Ridge in the early 90s. There were also, in addition, there were the official security folks I mentioned earlier who would go around and look at your badges and make sure you weren't doing what you weren't supposed to be doing. And then there were, and the badges, I mean, I have to say, it wasn't just you can live here, you can work here. There were also color codes and numbers that would determine which floor you could go up to in a particular building or which bathroom you could use. I mean, it was extremely controlled. But there were also unofficial informants as well. Helen, the woman I showed earlier, she was approached shortly after she arrived by two men, and they take her aside, they come to her dorm, she gets a knock on the door, and they ask her, would you mind, you know, paying very close attention to the conversations taking place around you in the cafeteria, in the dorm, at work, and if you hear somebody being a little too chatty or getting a little too curious about what's going on, would you please fill out this little form that says who was talking and what they were saying and where it happened, and then put it in this little pre-addressed envelope. The envelopes, and then it goes in an anonymous drop box no one will ever know. And the envelopes were made out to the Acme Insurance Company, which always sounds like Wile E. Coyote to me. It just always makes me laugh. And a lot of people did this. I heard this, many people were recruited to do this. So you walked around every day knowing that it wasn't just, you know, the official guys watching you, but anybody, anywhere could be listening to what you were talking about. And people who were too chatty or did get too curious, they just weren't at work the next day. I mean, you were gone. They just wouldn't take the risk. I just love this picture. It's Girl Scouts in front of the nuclear reactor. This to me this is Oak Ridge. It's like there's Girl Scouts and then there's the nuclear reactors. It's such a combination of worlds, and Ed's just a tremendous photographer. It was also stressful because everything grew so quickly. There were a lot of lines. Colleen likes to joke that if she saw a line, she got on it because she was sure there must be something good at the other end of it. There were lines because of all the coupons. Things were rationed like, you know, sugar and flour and meat and all, and gasoline and all those things. They might get nylons or cigarettes once or twice every 2 or 3 weeks, and people would flock to get those. So it was actually particularly difficult for housewives. For a lot of the young women, especially ones from very rural situations, coming to Oak Ridge for them, even though it was muddy and crazy, they were living in dorms and making good money and meeting young men and riding buses and going to the cafeteria. It was very much like what they thought college might be like had they had the chance to go. So, but you know, for a mother who came with her husband who was previously living in, you know, New York or Washington, D.C., it was a little bit of a shock. And you know, they were home all day and they had to trudge through the mud with, you know, like little wagons to get their groceries and the lines everywhere. It was very, very stressful. And, you know, overall, there was a lot of stress working because it was 24 hours a day. So somebody was always working somewhere. And that does start to get, you know, a little exhausting. So one of the things that they did was it became very clear that two things were needed. One, a psychiatric doctor in the clinic, and they brought him in. And two, they needed recreation. And, you know, I mentioned Elizabeth Edwards earlier. They wanted a way to really just make sure that if people were going to work hard, they were going to get to play hard as well. So there were dances almost every night of the week. There were fundraisers. Here's the Sunday Punch, a B-25 bomber that they bought by raising money with giving up their Sunday's pay, Sunday Punch. There were high school games. There were schools. There were families there, so there were schools. Now, when the high school played, the opposing team didn't get a roster. They just got numbers because they didn't want anybody to be able to see the last name of any of the students and pair that with a scientist and then somehow figure out what they might be doing there. So the players had numbers but no names given. And there was a lot of bowling. I mean, you could go bowling, roller skating. There was a rabbit breeders club. There, every sport you could imagine, and 24 hours a day. So I mean, you could do this in the middle of the night. The idea was, in order to alleviate the stress, they did not want. There was a big problem with turnover, so they were trying to keep people as happy as possible. Which was tricky because everyone's working very hard and everybody's telling them, we got to hit this deadline, we got to hit this deadline. We can't tell you what the deadline is or why we have to hit it, but it's really important that we get there first. And that creates a lot of stress. So the idea was, if you can't know what you're doing, we're going to try and keep your social life as active and interesting as possible so you don't leave and go get another job somewhere. So this was taken at the end of the war. The majority of people in Oak Ridge and elsewhere working on the Manhattan Project learned what they had been working on August 6th, 1945, when the first atomic bomb used in combat was detonated over Hiroshima, Japan. Now I say first atomic bomb used in combat because there had been a test in the desert in New Mexico roughly a month earlier. The way information spread varied. This was before even television, so you either heard things on the radio, you heard it from another person, or you saw it in the newspaper. So at first, because people were constantly monitoring developments in the war, the first kind of, waves of information were there's some huge new development in the war, there's some new weapon, and there's going to be an address. Everybody's got to listen to the address. So people get in front of their radios if they can, and Truman gives his address, and towards the end of that address, he actually mentions the town of Oak Ridge by name. Now, this stuns everyone, because in a way they'd gotten so used to not even knowing what they were doing, and all of a sudden the president is talking about them on the radio. So that really got everybody, wondering what was happening, because on the one hand, while the big secret was out, that being that Oak Ridge had something to do with this new weapon, lots of little secrets still remained. Nobody took Colleen aside and said, so here's what was going on with those pipes. None of that stuff was discussed. All they knew is that the town had something to do with it. And, oops, why am I going that way? There we go, okay. So another question that came up very quickly for people is Oak Ridge going to continue to exist? There was no post-war plan for Oak Ridge. This town was built for one reason and one reason only, and all they were thinking about is get it built, get the plants up, get people working in them, and we'll figure whatever's going to happen later. Who knows? The place probably won't even be here. So a lot of people start leaving. This is a document I found in the archives. It's from the head of the hospital, and he's basically asking, do you think we need a funeral home? This is the kind of thing that nobody had thought about. I mean, so much thought went into creating this town, but they kept using Knoxville's funeral homes for any people who died. And this was, well, gee, do you think we need a funeral home? And the answer was no, let's not do it yet. Because even then, nobody had any idea how long Oak Ridge was going to be around, or if it would be around after the war. And they just kept telling people, stay on the job, keep working. And so, a lot of people left because they wanted to be home when their brothers or their children got home from fighting. But a lot of people, it had become, in its own weird sort of way, a very important community to them. Not a lot of us know what it's like to actually be the first members ever of a town when it exists. And, on the other hand, if you take, the average age in Oak Ridge was late 20s. You take a bunch of single young men and a bunch of single young women and stick them behind a fence and send them to dances every night of the week, there are going to be some marriages, and there are going to be some babies, and And it really, in its own, muddy, crazy kind of way, began to feel like home to a lot of people. And I often wonder if they had intended to pull up stakes and leave, if that would have even been possible. I love this photo because they've come out to take a picture, but everybody's got their washboard because that meant everything. The washboard, you couldn't let your washboard go because the laundry would just tear up your homes. So Oak Ridge does continue to exist. And when I gave this talk in Oak Ridge, I told them when I'd given it in New York and in DC, and in both places, people said, "Is Oak Ridge still there?" The Oak Ridgers today got a big kick out of that. Oak Ridge is still there. It is now about 28,000 people, as opposed to 75 to 80,000 people at the end of World War II. The Oak Ridge National Lab is there, which is one of the top research facilities in the world. They sometimes make fun of it on Big Bang Theory, which is always funny. And Y-12 is still there. It's part of the National Nuclear Security Agency. Our country's supply of enriched uranium is still there. And a lot of the people that I interviewed are actually still there too. And talking about that, I can't say enough how important it is to get people's stories down. When I would go to talk to these women, almost every time someone would say to me, when I'd ask them if I could talk to them about this book I'm working on, "Oh, you don't want to talk to me, I didn't know anything." And just didn't value kind of their own experience because they weren't one of those people who knew everything. But of course they had plenty to say, and they had all kinds of perspectives that I hadn't heard before, and it was incredibly valuable. So if you know anyone who worked on the Manhattan Project, please get in touch with the Atomic Heritage Foundation Voices of the Manhattan Project. And just in general, take grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, sit down at the kitchen table, get out a tape recorder, hear what they have to say. There are so many oral history organizations across the country, and I can't tell you what a resource it is for writers and professors and students, and everybody's perspective is incredibly valuable. Today we often say things like, we need a Manhattan Project for childhood obesity. We need a Manhattan Project for energy independence. We need a Manhattan Project for failing cities. We say this all the time, and but yet we remain woefully undereducated about the Manhattan Project. There are a lot of efforts right now. There is a bill that just passed the House to create a Manhattan Project National Park in the 3 sites, Los Alamos, Hanford in Washington, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It would preserve the structures that are there, and there would be park rangers there to discuss not just the scientific developments, but the human stories as well that went into not just the creation of the bomb, but also the nuclear medicine that resulted from that. A lot of all of it, just preserving all of it so that people can understand it all a little bit better. And I think it's a good thing, and that it should be supported, because those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it all. There's so much to be learned from this moment in time. Nuclear weapons, nuclear medicine, nuclear energy, these things continue to have a tremendous impact on our social, economic, political landscape. Anything that you see that happens in the news, North Korea, anything, you can draw a line straight back from that to those high school girls in Tennessee. And so I think it's important that we remember that everybody's experience is valuable, and I hope I've shared some of those experiences in an interesting way. And if you're interested, this is where you can find me. And now I think we have time for a few questions. Yes? Okay, that's it. And I can answer a few questions, and then if anybody has a book they want signed, I can do that too.
So
yes.
How did you talk to any of these women about how they felt when they found out what was really going on there?
I did, yes.
Like when they found out the scope of what was happening, did they feel bad about it? Or?
It's, what's interesting about, she asked if I talked to women about how they felt about what happened once they learned what was happening. What was interesting is, and what I tried to capture in the book was, the fact that these people lived in two completely different worlds, really. A world with nuclear weapons and a world without nuclear weapons. I don't know what it's like to live in that other world. I've always known when I hear the bomb, I know what that means, and there's a button you can push and everything's done for, and fallout shelters and nuclear winter and radiation sickness. When they heard about the bomb dropping, that whole knowledge did not exist for them. So, and also initially, the pictures coming out of Japan were being censored. So you would see the building devastation, but the kinds of images we've all seen with the severe, you know what I'm talking about. That wasn't seen for a while. And actually the ramifications of radiation sickness started to be better understood afterward. The fact that even more, the death toll in August was very different than the death toll in December. So there was kind of this gradual understanding of the impact that this had. Now, that said, it was still, one of the women I interviewed, and I talk about this in the book, she said it was kind of gut churning. And it was also very complicated for them because you see pictures of the end of World War II. This was a horrible war that everybody so wanted to be over. Sailors kissing girls in Times Square and ticker tape parades, and everybody who worked on the project, of course, wanted to be a part of that. They were happy the war was over, but they had this whole other set of feelings to deal with that really nobody else did. And one woman I interviewed, I think, put it perfectly. Marty, she said, I was so happy when the war was over. She said, but I was also really sad because I like people and a lot of people died. And it's really simple, but that's it. Very complicated and just really unique to this population experiencing that. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm seeing this, especially that first picture, the line of the women.
You want me? I could probably go back
Which
to
looks a little bit like the first computers or something.
Yeah.
What were they doing, and how involved were they with the nuclear product itself,
Yep.
plutonium, and to what extent have statistics shown even the contamination there at Atomic City for these women? Have they, and birth rates and all those things that we follow today.
That is a question tailor-made for a documentary. I'll try and answer as much of it as I can without, as quickly as I can. First, what were these women doing? These women were working in the Y12 plant. Y12 was the home of the electromagnetic separation process. Okay, to enrich uranium is to separate atoms of uranium that are different isotopes, okay? In other words, there is uranium-235 and uranium-238. One is much more fissionable than the other. So they would separate them to have the more fissionable uranium, and that's what was used as fuel for the bomb. Oak Ridge's main focus was uranium. There was one pilot plant that dealt with plutonium that was actually a pilot nuclear reactor. But plutonium, which was used in the bomb that was detonated over Nagasaki, that was handled primarily in Hanford in Washington State. So these women were turning knobs and dials, and they were trained to turn knobs and dials. They were trained to make sure that this particular needle stayed in a particular position. If it went a little bit too far this way, you turn the knob back this way. If it went a little too far this way, you turn the knob that way. And it had things on it like G voltage and M voltage, and there were E boxes. Nothing had its real names. And that's all they were trained to do. They had no idea. The uranium was in another room, in a sealed, these women really, not really at any risk, really. There were people who were in one of the plants. Oh, how did that happen? Oh, sorry. There we go. In one of the plants, or rather one of the facilities here, you had to actually wear a jumpsuit to work. And those, you would turn those in at the end of the day, and they would be washed, and the water would be filtered to see if they could capture any uranium, and that would go to the chemistry lab. I mean, they would try and get it anywhere they could. If you were washing out those jumpsuits, you were probably in a different position than you were if you were working here. When we think about the Manhattan Project sites, our minds go immediately to uranium and plutonium. But these were just large industrial sites. So, I mean, you also had things like, you had a lot of mercury, fluorine, which is very nasty, beryllium, which is a whole other ball of wax. And of course, you know, they were building all these prefab structures with something called cemesto, which was a combination of cement and asbestos, which everybody loved. It was fantastic. So, you know, this was a long time ago. Did they take precautions? Absolutely. Are the same precautions we would take today? No, they're not. So, in many ways, this is a story still being told. Today, there is money available from the Department of Energy for people who worked not just on the Manhattan Project, but you know, Rocky Flats, various testing facilities, if you develop certain kinds of cancers. You can apply, you know, show that you worked there, and you know, you can get reparations from the government. It really depends on what your contact was.
Isn't it kind of hard because of the veil of secrecy of the time? Even today, isn't it hard for people who feel maybe they were working close to an atomic, you know, some experimental laboratory that they think they were, but they can't even find out. You know, is it easy to find out?
Oh, well, I mean, if you worked in if you were, you didn't have to prove you worked in a specific facility. You just had to have lived and worked in the town. So, I mean, if you were a secretary in a school building and you developed cancer, I mean, you could get reparations too. But they still check people. I interviewed a woman, a woman came to one of my talks who had worked in Oak Ridge in the 80s. So, I mean, not Manhattan Project, 40 years later. And they had just tracked her down. She was living in a different state. And it was time for her to go in for her beryllium scan. So, I mean, this is a constant thing that's going on. And lots of different studies get done. I mean, obviously, people I talked with here were in very close proximity to these materials, and they're in their 90s. There are other people who, you know, plutonium, again, that's, you know, very tricky stuff. And it's wide variety of things. But yes, it is on people's mind, and there is a program with the government to get reparations for that. Yes, ma'am?
So I grew up in Oak Ridge in the 50s and 60s.
You did?
And
did you know any of the blacks, either Jimmy Black or Suzanne?
Doesn't ring
No?
a bell.
Okay.
Doesn't ring a bell. But at any rate, one of the things I loved about your book was the way that you talked about the young women who came from high schools all over Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
Because my impression and my family friends when I was growing up had, even then in the 50s, had come from somewhere else. Some of them had been there during the war, but their parents. But others had come, but they came from elsewhere. And there was still the feeling that Oak Ridge wasn't Tennessee and Tennessee wasn't Oak Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
But you described so nicely these young women who had finished high school, who were recruited out of high school, and I love that you said that they did what they were told. Was one of the reasons that they were recruited, but it gave me a better picture of how Tennessee really did contribute, and there was much more. It really was part of Tennessee, even though they sort of denied that it was.
Oh yeah, and were you in one of the? Everybody always likes to talk about the schools had to be very good. They brought in teachers, excellent teachers, because they had scientists, Nobel Prize winners who were bringing their families there, and they were not going to stay and they were not going to be there if their kids could not get a good education. So I would talk to people who went to high school there, especially in the 50s and 60s, who said it was the strangest thing because you would be sitting in a classroom, because most public schools in the United States are still economically segregated. Depending on neighborhoods, and you would be in these high school classrooms. You would have, you know, the child of a guy who laid sheetrock every day, sitting next to literally the child of a Nobel Prize winner, and it was a really unique community. And Oak Ridge High School, and I think it still has an excellent reputation, but I mean, like record numbers of merit scholarships, and it's a fascinating place, and the first high school in the state to desegregate. Also,
When?
yeah.
When?
The year it was in 55 when the law came down in 55, right at the beginning. Yeah. So, yes.
I have two questions. One is, who hired the photographer? Because if it was so secret, like, why do these pictures exist?
Yeah.
And then the other question is kind of dark, but I was just wondering if there are any reports of sexual assaults or, anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. I can answer both of those actually, quite authoritatively. I love when that happens. So Ed Westcott was hired by the War Department. So he was hired by the Manhattan Project to document everything that went on there. So he had access that nobody else had, because they knew that if the project, whether it was a success or a failure, they wanted a visual catalog of everything that had gone on there. So he took pictures of construction, he took pictures of daily life, the pictures are quite fascinating. The close-ups of just machinery and vacuum pumps and everything you can imagine. So he was on the record as doing that. He also was sent on a train in the middle of the night to take a photo of General Groves in Washington, D.C. right after the Trinity test. Of course, Ed didn't know the Trinity test had taken place, but they wanted a portrait of him taken that day, so they stuck him on this train and he went up to D.C. to go take that portrait. So Ed was official. It wasn't the Department of Energy then, it was the War Department.
But they were private photos at that time.
Oh my God, yes. Oh yeah, no, yeah. Oh, of course, I see, yes. No, yeah, these were declassified years later. But you can see them, I mean, now they belong to all of us. Sexual assault, there were a lot of the same kinds of crimes that you would have found elsewhere. If you go to the National Archives, if this is a topic you're interested in about that period of time or this project, you can go to the National Archives and the medical records are there, and you can actually see the records from, in a lot of places, from each different month, and it'll say the number of abortions, number of sexual assaults, aggravated assault, things like that. I didn't study that carefully, but there was crime there like there was elsewhere. A lot of it was drunken brawling was a big chunk of it. But yes, so that that existed the same way it would have outside the gates. Yes.
There was a book written about the women in Los Alamos.
Years ago, yeah.
Yes. Have you ever met that author or know anything about that?
I have not met that author. I do know about that, and it was so hard for them to get that published. I read about that experience, and at the time, actually there's a woman I mentioned in my book. She's not one of the main characters. Her name is Vi Warren. She was the wife of the head of the medical section for the entire Manhattan Project. And her experience is really interesting because she and her husband, she was very highly educated. I think she had like a master's or a PhD or something. She was very smart and always sort of had this open kind of discussion relationship with her husband. And as soon as they got to Oak Ridge, or as soon as he started working on the Manhattan Project, all of a sudden he wasn't talking to her about anything anymore. And she understood, but it was very frustrating for her because she was an extremely intelligent woman. So the way she sort of worked through that was she wrote a column for the local paper about what that was like. And they're really incredibly insightful. And her papers were at the University of UCLA. And I got a hold of her papers and her husband's papers. He actually helped start the medical school there, so they have a lot of his stuff. And in it, she tried in the 60s, I want to say, to publish a book about Oak Ridge, and nobody cared. And she's a great writer. Like, her columns are fantastic. Nobody cared. So in the papers, there were like rejection letters from publishers and things, and it's amazing stuff. Yeah. Oh, hold on. I'll come back to you. Yes.
I assume current history textbooks now talk about Los Alamos, but do they talk about Oak Ridge and do they talk about Washington?
I don't know. I really don't know. I had somebody come to one of my talks who lived in Los Alamos for 30 years and told me they didn't know anything about Oak Ridge. And I'm going to Albuquerque. I'll be in Albuquerque on Friday, actually, at the Nuclear Museum, and that's close to Los Alamos. So I'm hoping we'll get some of that crowd there. But I talk to teachers whenever I can about how much teachers who do touch on the end of World War II, it goes a little bit like this. There was a bomb, we dropped it, the war was over. that was it. Part of that is, the amount of time they have to talk about all this stuff, and part of it is to talk about it properly. You really need to come at it from a lot of different ways. The science is a little confusing for, depending on the age, but, I think there should certainly be a lot more of it. Absolutely. Yes?
Yeah, about that book, and then I was thinking while I'm reading, because you have the chapters on the scientists specifically, where you really go into depth about how it's being made in the process. And I was just like, is there too much information that you're putting out there? Like, maybe that's why that book wasn't published or something? Like,
oh, you mean like somebody could figure,
Yeah.
Oh, they could figure all that stuff out. The technologies, what's funny is the technology, and, they're still using cyclotrons to separate uranium. You read articles about it when it comes up in other countries, and they're trying to enrich uranium. Some of the processes are still very similar. And when I thought about how much science I wanted to be in the book, and the book is compartmentalized the way Oak Ridge and the Manhattan Project was. So I tried to keep the science and the the knowledge part separate from the experiences of the women. But I realized that this might be the only book about the Manhattan Project that someone would read, or maybe if they'd read one, it had been a long time, and I wanted to make sure that people kind of understood the full scope of what was going on, because that does kind of impact the way you relate to the women's stories if you know what's going on in the background. But I think the genie's out of the bottle as far as what they're doing. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Did they ever regret? I mean, once they found out what they were doing, did they ever regret being part of that?
Regret being part of it, I don't know if I ever talked to someone who put it that way. There are people I interviewed who did not think the bomb should have been used, but they didn't regret, the woman I'm thinking of didn't regret signing up to work on a war project, because that's what everybody did. So it was, again,
Not knowing, doing something they were unaware of what they were doing.
right, no, they didn't, no, it was, most, the people I talked to, they felt so committed to doing something. You were expected to do something for the war. And, people were a lot more content not to know. And it wasn't like they were, I was talking to one woman about this, it wasn't like they were lied to. It wasn't like they were told, you're doing this, and then they found out they were really doing this other thing. They were just told, you don't get to know. And so, in that sense, they knew they were entering into something that, was going to remain a mystery to them. Yes, sir.
Obviously, the scope of the project is immense and very interrelated. Like this picture here, the women are just supposed to know, keep the dial within this thing.
Yeah.
But did they have this whole process designed before they installed it from somewhere else, or did they sort of design it as they went along?
That's a little bit of both. In this particular case, they originally thought that these were going to be operated by PhDs from Berkeley. Okay, Ernest Lawrence was the father of the...
Who's the they?
The they would be, the big they would be General Groves, who was head of the project all together. Nichols, who was head of administration and oversaw some of the contracting that went on at Oak Ridge. And then Oppenheimer and whoever would be or Ernest Lawrence in this case, there was always a scientific component involved in some of the decision making too, because they were the guys who understood how these machines worked. So it would have been any combination of any of the people who, like in this particular case, Ernest Lawrence, the scientist who developed the electromagnetic separation process, was talking to Colonel Nichols, who was the administrative head at Oak Ridge, about who was going to be training and operating this machinery. And they thought it was going to be PhDs, because how could anybody else operate these complex, crazy things? And Nichols, who was military, said, we can handle that. We just need a good company to train them. And I'm telling you, you're going to be better off with young, obedient women. And this is what they wanted. They wanted young women who were not going to question what they were told. And this was an argument that went back and forth between them, and they actually did an unofficial contest. They had the PhDs run these machines for a shift, and they had what Ernest Lawrence referred to as the hillbillies operate them for a shift. And the women did much, 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 much better. Because the PhDs were always like, well, maybe if I did it a little bit this, they were always kind of fidgeting and thinking and blah, blah, blah. And from a very military standpoint, they told the women, do this, do this, do this. Yes, sir. They did that, and things ran more smoothly. So, I mean, from a training standpoint, it was a fascinating. I mean, not that there weren't oversights and screw ups when you're dealing with an operation that big, but I mean, from a training standpoint, it's fascinating stuff. And there are certain books that just talk about the training and the companies involved and things like that, and it's quite mind-boggling. Yes, sir.
You might want to mention the book that Groves wrote in the 60s about, it would answer this question very well.
Oh, it's in my endnotes. Oh yeah, Now It Can Be Told by General Groves. Yeah, Groves's book and Nichols' book I used to reflect on what they were thinking at the time. But yes, that's a great book. Alma, how do you like to do the signing part?
So we've got books for sale at the register if you'd like to purchase a book, and then you can have Denise sign it for you or personalize it or whatever. Thanks to Denise for absolutely amazing talk.